Hello, my name is Margaret Humphreys, and I teach history and history of medicine at Duke University. And today I'd like to tell you about an illustrious North Carolina family who you probably have never heard of. The family's last name is Harris, which makes them hard to research since it's probably the most common name in North Carolina in the antebellum period. But this family, I'm particularly interested in the third son, Joseph Dennis Harris, who lived a remarkable life. It was remarkable in part because he was African American, and he was born in 1833 when North Carolina was still a slave state. He became a physician, he wrote books, and he even ran for lieutenant governor of Virginia. So this is Joseph Dennis Harris, a photo taken in 1868. You can see the photo is radiating respectability and professionalism. He has a tie with a tie tack. He has a book in his hand. He's wearing a suit. And he looks very accomplished there, as indeed he was. This was the year he ran for lieutenant governor of Virginia. He also had remarkable brothers, sons and daughters of these two people who we do not have photographs of, who were living in Fayetteville, North Carolina in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s when they had 10 children. Mother's name is Charlotte Dismukes Harris, and dad is Jacob Harris. Both of them were either mulatto in the census, and that was an official designation, M, or free colored in the 1830 census. We know Jacob Harris was from New Bern, North Carolina, where he was freed by his white father, as was typical at that time in New Bern. Now I'll tell you about the brothers before we get on to JD. The Reverend William D. Harris was the oldest boy of this crowd. I don't have a picture of him, sad to say. He was a self-taught preacher, and he was accepted to preach in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Richmond after the Civil War. It's a great big church. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church in general had been created in the antebellum period because the Methodist Church in the South would not admit Black people. So it's an alternative, even protest Methodist church. It was a large, needy congregation, and William D. Harris ran a school at night for particularly after the Civil War, the freedmen, the freed slaves. He was later transferred to a church in Georgetown and District of Columbia, and then to Charleston. This is the 3rd Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in Richmond. So you get a sense he was taking charge of a big church and a big congregation. Then second and third, I want to talk about two other brothers, Robert Harris and Cicero Harris. So we know more about them than we might because of an author named Charles Chesnutt, who is quite a famous African-American author in the late 19th century. Richard Broadhead, former president of Duke University, wrote about Chesnutt and edited his journals. He studied at the State Colored Normal School in the 1870s, where Robert Harris was a teacher and the first leader. That State Colored Normal School went through various transmutations to become Fayetteville State University, and they have this painting in their archives. Then baby brother was Cicero Harris, who became a bishop. He too studied with brother Robert and then went to a Peabody school in Charlotte. These were a series of schools set up after the Civil War, again to teach the freedmen. And Chesnutt worked with him there. One of the things Cicero Harris told Charles Chesnutt is keep your fingernails clean and always come to the table with clean hands. You have to act respectable to be treated as respectable. And this whole family projects that attitude that we are respectable, learned gentlemen. So this is where the Howard School started. This was hand-built by the Freemen in the 1870s with money from local supporters. At one point, it was the Fayetteville State Teachers College, and you see by this old historical marker that it was for Negroes. Cicero Harris was the first African-American bishop in the Zion Methodist Episcopal Church, which is another branch of Methodism. He founded Zion Wesley College in his own home. It sounds a bit bigger than something he did in his living room, but he and his wife again were pushing to educate the freemen. Zion Wesley College moved to Salisbury and was reborn as Livingston College in 1881, and that still flourishes in Salisbury today as a historically Black Christian school. So here's C.R. Harris's headstone with his wife, and Livingston College founded again with a historic marker. So these were important steps, particularly for the freed people, and the Harris family felt a lot of obligation to the freed people. So let's get back to who this remarkable couple was and what we can say speculating about them. Charlotte Dismukes Harris comes out of the Dismukes family in some way. Was she the offspring of a Daddy Dismukes and a Black slave? We don't know. There was a Charlotte Dismukes slave in that family when Mr. Dismukes dies in the 1850s. Perhaps that was her mother. I don't know. The Dismukes, there's a Dismukes son, a white son, who ran the local newspaper. And then one of Charlotte Harris's daughters is listed as a typesetter in 1860. So I think newspaper production runs in that side of the family. One of the sons knew how to read French by the time he was 30. She may have taught them French, and she may have been connected to mulatto self-called families that came from Guadalupe. It's a complicated world to try to figure out who was connected to whom when everything was a secret. The father worked in various artisanal crafts. He could build you a house. He could put up plaster. Some of his sons were apprenticed to blacksmiths or to harness makers. So the idea was that they would be able to support themselves when they outgrew the family home. Jacob dies in 1844, and Mother Charlotte takes the remaining young children to Cleveland in 1850 because the South was getting very unpleasant. So this is downtown Fayetteville, an old picture. Obviously, I can't say exactly how old. Photography would not have been common until 1860s or so. The infamous, famous marketplace where slaves were sold. It's under discussion now for whether it should be torn down because of that. You see all these horse and buggies and trade going on. It was the Free Black Artisanal Network that kept those carts built in order, the horses shoed and all the rest of it. So we can see, looking at legal records, that the free Black adults swore for each other on, say, a bond that so-and-so is borrowing money and a neighbor swears to support the bond. Their children intermarry. It's a thriving, supportive network. But after 1835, as John Hope Franklin has written, he's a historian, famous historian, who wrote this book as his PhD thesis in 1943, North Carolina's government, which was all white, started getting nervous about these free Negroes. There'd been revolutions, Negroes trying to overthrow slavery, and they began to clamp down on the freedom of the Negroes, as they called them, in North Carolina in the 1830s. They took away the right to vote. The Harris children, their father could vote, but they couldn't until they moved out of the South. There were greater restrictions on movement. people had to have papers wherever they went. And there was also fear of being kidnapped and put back into slavery. So Charlotte thought it was time to get out and took the family to Ohio in 1850, as did many prosperous artisanal types who could earn their living when they got north. After the war, one of the locals in Fayetteville told Charles Chestnut, I mentioned before, all the best families left. And it was just an example of white Southerners having a bad policy. Now, Franklin, just because I love this picture, received the Medal of Freedom from Bill Clinton in September 29th, 1995. It is not too ridiculous to say that I'm working on this project because of John Hope Franklin, not because he told me to do it or anything like that, but he opened way up the world of African-American history, found sources, helped the rest of us know how to go about doing this. So the family went to Cleveland in the early 1850s. J.D. Harris was 19, 20 then. He was a restless 19, 20-year-old. He didn't want to work on his brother's farm, which is probably his first job when he got there. He went west, seeking his own farm in Iowa, which was just opening up. He thought Iowa would be a land of freedom. It was the North. It would lack discrimination. And under the Homestead Act, he could get, or one of the Homestead Acts, he could get his own farm. But he found when he got there that the laws were still against him, that Blacks could not receive the same rights when it came to homesteading. And I mean, he could buy a farm, but he didn't have the money for that. And he was very angry at political discussions in Iowa in this time about protecting the freedom and the rights of Black people. There were two political parties. There were the people in North Iowa and the people in Southern Iowa that were snug up to Missouri. And it was hardly a place of non-discrimination. One of the most curious things about this poem, which talks about what he has seen in his life so far, is he puts an MD after his name. He didn't have an MD. He may have wanted an MD at that point, but he didn't get his medical degree until 1864. So he goes to Cleveland, where his family, several people in his family have settled. This is Cleveland in the 1850s. And there, to use a modern phrase, he was radicalized. He joined an anti-slavery society, the sort of place that one could not imagine joining or gathering in an anti-slavery society in Fayetteville, North Carolina, but in Cleveland, it was legal. Because of the Fugitive Slave Act, there was a man who was escaping slavery, and he got to Oberlin College, which was a well-known anti-slavery center, and some white seekers of this advanced slave or this escaped slave who wanted to get the reward for him, captured him, and took him to the town of Wellington, which is near Oberlin, and the train station there. Well, a whole bunch of mostly white people, including Charles Langston, whose brother John Mercer Langston was also a well-known figure in African-American history as the first Black lawyer in Ohio. They rescued the fellow in the Wellington Rescue and got him to Canada. One thing you might not think about is that Cleveland is in essence on the Canadian border, because you get in a boat and you row across the lake and you're in Canada. So this showed that the nasty talons of the slavery interests could reach all the way into northern Ohio. Also, Harris, J.D. Harris now, knew John Brown Jr., son of John Brown Sr. of Harper's Ferry. Both the Browns tried to find soldiers, recruited soldiers in that area. And J.D. Harris knew a guy named Lewis Sheridan Leary, who was from Fayetteville. He was a boyhood friend of J.D. Harris, about the same age. The Learys as I said before, they signed back and forth as witnesses on documents with the Harris family. Well, Leary died with John Brown at Harper's Ferry, and J.D. Harris was in communication with him. In fact, there was a letter from J.D. Harris in the papers found with John Brown. And there was an expanding manhunt after the Harper's Ferry raid, and Harris was afraid that he'd be found. So he left Cleveland, went to New York. Sometimes it's helpful to have a name like J. Harris, and decided he had to leave the country. Now, most people from Northern Ohio went to Ontario, where there were escaped slave communities in Chatham, Ontario, for example. But there was also the lure of going to the Caribbean and colonizing with other Blacks there. And I think the North Carolina boy thought about Ontario, and he thought about Haiti, and he went to the Caribbean. One of the first things he did was write for a newspaper in New York an account of why the Caribbean was a great place for American Blacks to escape to. And the thought at this time was there was no place, this is 1859, 1860, no place for the Black man in America. He was not safe anywhere. Someone could put him in irons and claim he was an escaped slave. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, you have some sense of how that could happen. And they should go where they naturally belong, the tropics, like Africa, but closer to build farms. And they were invited by the government of Haiti to come and help them build farms and tame the country. So J.D. Harris went all in on supporting immigration of American Blacks to Haiti. He was, after things calmed down a bit in the United States, he was hired to go from Black community to Black community in the North, recruiting Blacks to come, and eventually was the leader of one of those colonies. But over the first 2 years of this enterprise, the colonies failed rather dramatically. Fever got a lot of them. I mean, the Caribbean is well known for yellow fever, malaria, other kinds of diseases, and these people had no immunity to it. They didn't know how to do the work that was needed. They were mostly town people, and the whole process failed. And the Blacks came back to the United States, the ones who survived. And he came back in 1862. There was a war on, you may remember. And he decided the best way he could serve, because he's almost 30 at this point, was to train as a doctor. Some of his nephews actually joined the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, the one that they made the movie Glory about. But he thought he was better off training as a doctor, and he acquired that training in a somewhat complex way. But by 1864, he had a medical degree, and he got hired by the federal government, the US federal government, as a doctor. He practiced in this building, which you see is labeled Hotel Monroe in Portsmouth, Virginia. Obviously, this is not a Civil War era photograph. You see the automobile there, and I don't know that it has changed very much, though, since the Civil War. Maybe they have fire escapes now and they didn't before, not sure. They got a movie theater, it looks like. But you can imagine wards laid out on this sort of building for hospital beds. And he worked in the Black ward. By this point, there were, in 1864, there were regiments of Black troops, the US, so-called US colored troops. And when they got sick, they needed hospital beds. And of course, still the prejudice of the North said that white men and Black men couldn't be in a hospital together. So these were segregated hospital wards. And just a few days after Harris arrived, he made quite a splash to a reporter for the Christian Recorder, which was one of the two Black newspapers that were national. It obviously, you see from the Christian, it was a religious founded journal, but it took news reports from all over the country. And this was a letter written to them talking about what the person had seen in Richmond, and it's slightly exaggerated, but I still love it. So this sentence, the union-hating, rebel-loving, good men-provoking, and gallows-deserving Portsmouthians, so he's talking about the white Virginians who live in Portsmouth, were terribly startled, and with eyes extended, mouth open, hair on end, and hands in pockets, they could be seen in groups talking very low. A Union man approached one of the groups and inquired what was the matter. Why, says one of the FFVs, there's a N-word doctor in Portsmouth in the capacity of a U.S. surgeon. It was too much. A Negro MD upon the sacred soil. They could not stand it. Some of them tried to die. Others went in search of the last ditch. While Surgeon Harris, with an ability that is second to no surgeon in this department, is rendering invaluable service to the sick and wounded soldiers. Now, FFVs are First Families of Virginia. And there was a sort of standard saying among the Confederates that they would die in the last ditch. But certainly the fact that they could write this indicates that not only was Harris seen favorably, but also that he was seen remarkably, that it had happened. By 1865, he had moved to another hospital in that area, this one in Richmond, in Howard's Grove. And this little drawing, you can see it was a forest, a grove, and they built small buildings and had some tents. And there Harris was working when he met this gentleman, Ira Russell, MD, who was a Union surgeon who cared a lot about the Black troops. He was Northern, he was from Natick, Massachusetts. And he met Dr. Russell. Dr. Russell met Dr. Harris in the fall of 1865. This is actually the first clue I had that Harris existed. So Russell says in a report, I also visited the Howard Grove Hospital in charge of Dr. Harris, a very intelligent colored gentleman from Cleveland, Ohio. Now, Russell doesn't know he's originally from North Carolina. This hospital is managed by the Freedmen Bureau and is neat, orderly, and well located. Dr. Harris has seen a good deal of service, is familiar with the peculiarities of his race, and deeply interested in its elevation. And you see it's from the United States Sanitary Commission papers. Now, Russell is particularly good to talk about Harris because he recognized that a doctor taking care of colored regiments has to think it's worthwhile even paying attention to them. Now, back in the hospital he used to run in St. Louis, he had multiple wards of African-American troops. And he found some wards did well and others, they had a high mortality rate. And the doctors with the high mortality rate said, oh, it's not our fault, it's the patients. So Russell switched around the good wards, their doctors, with the bad wards, and found that it was the doctor, not the patient. So he concluded, it is often said, even by surgeons in charge of colored regiments, that it is of no use to doctor a sick Negro, that he will die, do what you may. I am satisfied that no greater a mistake can be committed. When I hear a surgeon making such a statement, I regard it as evidence of culpable indifference and neglect. Among no class of patients have I seen better results from treatment than among colored soldiers when proper care and study has been given to their disease. So again, it gives you a sense of who Russell is and what he saw when he met with Harris. He talked to him for quite a while. And it raises the larger point that we see in the modern era, and particularly is put forward as a reason for Black medical schools to teach Black doctors, by which I mean not so much that the schools are historically Black medical schools, but that the students who are Black see mentors who are Black, that their peers, that the peers of their teachers, the respected ones, are African American, and it shows them that they too can achieve the highest level in the field. Modern research has shown that when Black doctors treat Black patients, the outcomes improve. And it's difficult to quantify why. Maybe they listen better. I don't know. Maybe the patients aren't afraid of them. Now, looking at Harris, it's difficult to see specific outcomes because the data aren't there. But two anecdotes stand out that I want to talk about. After Howard's Grove, he transferred to a government hospital in Fredericksburg, where he was reprimanded for ordering extras. Now, a photograph of Fredericksburg after the war. You can see it had a rough time of it. One of these buildings could have been Harris's hospital. There's no address for it. It's just in Fredericksburg. Each floor held 25 patients lying side by side. So one of these might be quite possible for that. 50 former slaves, that is freed people, were hospitalized there. And we don't have outcomes or any of that sort of thing, but we have a few data points. In 1866, there was a widespread smallpox epidemic that affected the freedmen badly. And think about these people, they've been discharged from plantations. They may be living in camps with just tents for shelter, or not even that. They're not being fed very well. And then they get a disease like smallpox. So at one point, he ordered extra rations for 1,000 people. He didn't say why. He must have thought it was obvious that they would know why. He was running an outpatient clinic out of that hospital, or so-called dispensary. And smallpox patients knew he was there, and they came and camped out around the hospital, hoping to get help. They were the ones who needed the food, which is what he explained when he was called out for being extravagant. Then in the next year, he was criticized for ordering a load of boards. Send me some boards. And he described the boards and how many. And again, they said, what do you want them for? And he wanted them to create benches. So the beds in this hospital were bed ticks. A tick in this case is like a very large pillowcase with a drawstring at the end, and you stuff it full of straw, and that's the mattress. And you see him ordering straw as well to fill these, and they lay on the floor. There was no place to sit, and benches were just a minimum comfort in these barren hospitals. Perhaps could be moved outside when it was sunny and so forth. So he's a man who recognizes that benches will make a difference to patients, that getting up off the floor and sitting up will help them in their recovery, that patients need food. I mean, these are pretty obvious. But as Russell commented before, if you just say they're going to die no matter what you do, you don't think about benches or food. In 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau began to close down in Virginia. It was always meant to be temporary, they said over and over. And thousands of freedmen were left camped on the Virginia Peninsula down near Fortress Monroe, which is the first place that Blacks could escape slavery to Union lines. And Harris was at that point down at a hospital there. They moved him around a lot, like Army surgeons today. And he begged food for them. We can't just leave them to starve. And he was turned down. So he was perhaps a more decent guy, an advocate for the Black patients, and one admirable because of that. Now, in 1867, 1868, Virginia was still in the process of reconstruction. At this point, most Confederates, avowed open Confederates, could not vote unless they took an oath of office to the United States government, and most of them were too proud to do that. There were many whites who had moved into the area looking to make a fortune in, for example, building railroads. And there were a variety of Blacks who were seeking power in the government. And you can see some of them here. This is the state convention, and Harris would have been there because he spoke there, but where he was, he's not evidently any of these people that I can make out. So he's lost somewhere in the shadows. But it gives you an idea of what political convention looked like then. No big electric TV boards and so forth. Just one man talking on his feet. So Harris in this convention was chosen to run as lieutenant governor for Virginia. It was actually a scheme to hurt from the opponents, to hurt the Republican who was running for governor by linking a Black man with him. And that ticket lost. It wasn't Harris's fault. The governor candidate was a scoundrel involved in all sorts of railroad shenanigans. But so he lost that election. But from there, he got a job in Columbia, South Carolina, as a physician to the state mental hospital there. And at this point, appointments to a state mental hospital were something in the gift of a politician, not really something that was ruled by a doctor. And the politics in South Carolina were that the radical Republicans were still in force. So he got a job there. That lasted until the Democrats, the former Confederate types, came back in, and they were outraged at a Black physician in the state mental hospital, particularly since he was treating female patients as well as male patients. So they forced him out, and from there he went to Washington, D.C., which had a large Black population, probably the largest Black middle class population in the United States, and a brand new medical institution. Howard University Medical School, and the Freedmen's Hospital, where patients in Washington, D.C. Could be seen for free, or if they could pay, they paid. But he got an appointment there. He was also in private practice. He and his wife got a house that practically you could stand in their house and take this picture. He was right across the street and down the block a little bit. And things were going fairly well. He was growing in distinction. His friend John Mercer Langston was now in Washington, D.C., and was on the faculty at Howard, and eventually became president of Howard. And then medical disaster struck. But let's back up a little bit. He married a white, gasp, Northern missionary teacher who was in Virginia, providing help to the freedmen. They got married in North Carolina in Wayne County, and his brother, W.D. Harris, the preacher, officiated. It was not legal for a Black man to marry a white woman at that point. But on the other hand, if you got someone local to wink and nod and just send in the form without indicating that who was Black and who was white, it became a legal marriage license. The couple had 2 children. The last one born in 1872. And then in 1874, on a very hot day in Washington, D.C., he collapsed, went into seizure, was taken to St. Elizabeth's first, and then, taken to the Howard Hospital first, and then eventually to St. Elizabeth's, where he was committed. And that commitment required the assent of a public official in the District of Columbia. And that public official at that point in time happened to be Frederick Douglass. So he signed the commitment papers, which makes it likely that there were no shenanigans here. Nobody was lying about his state. He was hospitalized, and he stayed hospitalized. And he died in 1884 at St. Elizabeth's on Christmas Day. So these are his children. Worthy Harris Holden. Her mother's name was Elizabeth Worthington, so they called her Worthy. And she married this obviously white guy who was a doctor and lived on the West Coast. Here is Thoreau Dennis Harris, who was his son. And you can see that by the time he was an older man, he did look indeed quite white. And the 1920 census lists him as white. He ended up in a town in Arkansas where his papers gave us the photo of J.D. Harris. And they started celebrating Thoreau Harris on their African American History Day, because they don't have that many in that particular town of Arkansas. And Thoreau would have been quite surprised to understand he was Black again in the year 2000, when he had become white. He is famous in his own right for writing hymns in the Nazarene Church and some other churches. I have been in touch with his grandson, who is very pleased I'm writing this project. This is the death certificate for Joseph D. Harris. You see, Government Hospital for the Insane, chronic mania, epileptic apoplexy, and he died instantly. So that's the story of Joseph Dennis Harris, a boy born in Fayetteville who had quite a remarkable life.